In the 1950s, one factory in Birmingham did not just succeed, it acted as the absolute market dictator. 1 out of every 4 motorcycles sold on Earth carried their legacy. Picture a massive facility running relentlessly, with over 20,000 loyal workers building the machines that defined global transport. Then, the floors sat empty. The workers were gone. The machines were silenced. A sprawling industrial empire evaporated into bankruptcy and despair. How does something that important disappear? This is the story of the Birmingham Small Arms Company and the fatal boardroom arrogance that destroyed a British legend. Chapter 1. The Forge of the Gunmakers. Birmingham, in the middle of the 19th century, was a city forged in fire and choked by coal smoke. The air tasted of sulfur and hot iron. It was the undisputed industrial heart of the British Empire. In the center of this brutal landscape, 14 master gunsmiths gathered in 1861 to make a defining decision. They formed the Birmingham Small Arms Company. They chose a corporate symbol that left no doubt about their purpose. 3 crossed rifles. They built weapons. They armed soldiers. For years, the lucrative business of war kept their furnaces burning bright. They purchased 25 acres of wasteland in an area called Small Heath. They erected a massive factory complex. The red brick walls rose high above the terraced houses. The black chimneys pierced the sky. Inside those walls, thousands of men worked the heavy lathes and milling machines. They produced precision rifles for the British military. But the business of war is inherently unpredictable. When global conflicts slowed, the British government established its own state-run armory at Enfield. The lucrative military contracts vanished almost overnight. The great factory in Small Heath faced a devastating silence. The heavy machines stopped turning. The men stood idle in the cold halls. The founders realized a harsh truth. A factory of that massive scale could not survive solely on the intermittent appetite of war. Survival demanded a radical shift in thinking. The late 19th century brought a new mechanical obsession to the streets of Britain. It was the bicycle. The directors of BSA looked at their idle factory floor. They looked at their highly skilled workforce. They saw a path forward. The exact same heavy machinery used to bore a rifle barrel with absolute precision could draw seamless steel tubes for a bicycle frame. The microscopic tolerances required to craft a complex firing mechanism could be applied to manufacture perfectly round ball bearings and smooth gear hubs. The transition began. Men who had spent decades mastering the lethal geometry of firearms now applied their calloused hands to civilian transport. They milled hubs. They cut pedal cranks. They assembled wheels. The men of Small Heath did not know it at the time, but this shift saved the company from early bankruptcy. The factory roared back to life. The smell of gun oil was replaced by the smell of machine grease. BSA quickly became renowned for producing the most durable and precise bicycle components in Europe. But bicycles were merely a stepping stone. The turn of the 20th century introduced a new invention that would change the world forever. The internal combustion engine. The engineers at Small Heath watched the early pioneers of motorization with keen interest. They understood that adding an engine to a bicycle frame was the logical next step in their evolution. In 1903, they built their first experimental motorized bicycle. It was a crude machine, but it proved the concept. They spent the next several years refining their designs, testing metals, and pushing the limits of their manufacturing capabilities. The true pivot happened in 1910. BSA introduced its very first fully designed and manufactured motorcycle. It featured a 3.5 horsepower single-cylinder engine. It had a flat fuel tank and a sturdy belt drive system. It was built with the exact same uncompromising standards as their military rifles. It was heavy, reliable, and incredibly tough. The morning that the first production model rolled out of the Small Heath factory was a historic moment. The heavy wooden doors opened to the cobbled street. The test rider kicked the engine to life. The mechanical heartbeat of the single-cylinder engine broke the morning silence of the Birmingham slums. It did not sound like a gunshot. It sounded like the future. The factory workers gathered at the gates to watch the machine accelerate down the road, leaving a trail of blue smoke behind it. That single motorcycle represented a monumental transformation. A facility built to manufacture tools of death had successfully reinvented itself into a creator of freedom and mobility. The men in the boardroom, and the workers on the floor, had laid the foundation of a global empire. They could not yet imagine the scale of their success. They did not know that their machines would soon dominate racetracks, conquer continents, and define a generation. On that cold morning in 1910, as the exhaust note echoed off the red brick walls, the company of war officially became an empire of wheels. The legend of BSA had truly begun. Chapter 2. 1 in 4. After the destruction of the Second World War, the global economy hungered for movement. People needed to get to work. They needed cheap and efficient transport. BSA possessed the exact tools to satisfy that massive global hunger. They shifted their wartime production lines back to civilian vehicles with ruthless efficiency. The D1 Bantam rolled out of the factory doors in 1948. It was simple, rugged, and incredibly affordable. It became an instant sensation. Postal workers, commuters, and delivery riders bought them by the tens of thousands. But the BSA directors wanted more than just the commuter market. They wanted total global supremacy. In 1951, they executed a masterstroke. They bought out Triumph motorcycles for £2.5 million. Triumph built fast, glamorous, and exciting machines. They held the speed records. BSA built the reliable, indestructible workhorses. Together, this newly formed conglomerate crushed all domestic competition. They became the largest producer of two-wheeled vehicles on Earth. They held a monopoly on British engineering prestige. The Small Heath site expanded to swallow the surrounding neighborhoods. It became a sprawling industrial leviathan covering hundreds of acres. You could not see the end of the factory from the main gates. It required its own infrastructure just to keep the machines running. Over 20,000 workers clocked in for their shifts. The morning rush hour resembled an invading army marching toward the brick buildings. The company operated its own power station to feed the ravenous electricity demands of the heavy machinery. An internal railway network moved tons of raw steel and cast iron from the storehouses to the foundries. The heat inside the casting sheds was unbearable. Men worked stripped to the waist, pouring molten metal into sand molds to forge engine blocks. The sound of the drop hammers shook the foundations of the nearby terraced houses. It was a chaotic, dirty, and incredibly productive environment. It was the absolute pinnacle of heavy manufacturing. This massive complex required immense human capital. Entire streets in Birmingham existed solely because the factory paid their wages. Employment at BSA was an inherited right. Fathers brought their sons to the factory gates on their 16th birthdays. They taught them how to read a micrometer. They taught them how to true a spoked wheel. The workforce developed a fiercely loyal culture. They understood they were not just assembling metal parts. They were building a global reputation. The legendary BSA Gold Star emerged from these very assembly lines. It was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering. It dominated clubmen racing across the globe. When a worker in Small Heath watched a newsreel showing a British motorcycle winning a race in Daytona, he knew his hands had shaped that victory. The factory offered secure jobs, social clubs, sports teams, and a profound sense of identity. The workers felt invincible because the machines they built felt indestructible. The true measure of their power lay across the Atlantic Ocean. The United States market presented a golden opportunity. American riders returned from the war, seeking adrenaline. They looked at the heavy domestic brands and found them slow and cumbersome. They wanted the lightweight, aggressive performance of the British parallel twins. BSA and Triumph answered that call. They flooded the American dealerships with machines that redefined speed. The export numbers defied logic. Ships left the ports of Liverpool packed entirely with wooden crates containing Birmingham motorcycles. By the middle of the decade, the statistics cemented their absolute reign. 1 out of every 4 motorcycles sold worldwide originated from this single corporate entity. They did not just participate in the market, they dictated it. They owned the dirt tracks of California and the streets of London simultaneously. The revenue generated by these American sales created a river of foreign currency flowing directly into the corporate accounts. The financial success created a fatal byproduct. It generated profound corporate arrogance. The directors sat in their luxurious offices, far above the noisy factory floor. They looked at the soaring profit graphs and drew the wrong conclusions. They believed their current success guaranteed their future survival. The sheer volume of sales blinded them to the slow decay creeping into their operations. Their manufacturing equipment grew older. Their engine designs remained static. They continued to build motorcycles that leaked oil and vibrated fiercely. They viewed these flaws as traditional British character. They ignored the changing demands of the consumer. They believed that because they were the biggest, they were inherently the best. This supreme overconfidence paralyzed their ability to innovate. They mocked the idea that any foreign competitor could ever challenge their absolute dominance. They sat atop the largest motorcycle empire in human history, completely unaware that they had just passed their absolute peak. Chapter 3. The Arrogance of the Giant and the Storm from the East. The executives at Small Heath governed their empire from wood-paneled boardrooms. They drank expensive tea and congratulated each other on their immense success. The year was 1959. The profit margins looked extremely healthy on paper. But these men failed to look out the window. They failed to see a rapidly changing world. They believed British engineering possessed an untouchable supremacy. They thought a true motorcycle must leak a little oil to prove it had a mechanical soul. They thought heavy engine vibration simply meant raw, untamed power. They viewed their machines as the undisputed kings of every road on Earth. This deep-seated arrogance seeped into every level of top management. They stopped investing in basic research and development. They stopped upgrading their manufacturing tooling. The heavy machines that built the bikes grew tired, worn, and imprecise. Yet, the directors adamantly refused to acknowledge any weakness. They ignored the whispers of industrial change echoing across the globe. Thousands of miles away, a completely different manufacturing philosophy took root. In Japan, companies like Honda, Yamaha, and Suzuki quietly studied the British machines. They bought them, stripped them down to the last bolt, and analyzed every single component. They saw the glaring flaws. They saw the outdated electrical systems. They saw the porous engine casings. But they did not laugh at the British engineering. They simply went to work. The new Japanese factories looked nothing like the dark, soot-stained brick halls of Small Heath. They built brightly lit, hyper-clean facilities. They invested heavily in automated production lines. Their assembly workers wore crisp white overalls. They treated motorcycle manufacturing like an exact science, not a blacksmith's dark art. They focused intensely on precision, absolute reliability, and total consistency. They developed sophisticated multi-cylinder engines that ran with incredible smoothness. They introduced revolutionary features like electric push-button starters. A rider no longer needed heavy boots and strong legs to kickstart a stubborn, high-compression engine. They just pushed a small button and rode away. Reports of these new Japanese machines eventually reached the BSA boardroom in Birmingham. The British executives laughed them off. They dismissed them entirely. They called them plastic toys. They genuinely believed that real men rode heavy British twins, while only beginners would buy a small displacement Japanese bike. They failed to understand a fundamental business principle. The beginner of today inevitably becomes the loyal, paying customer of tomorrow. Honda launched their Super Cub model in the United States. They ran a massive advertising campaign with a very simple slogan: "You meet the nicest people on a Honda." This single campaign completely changed the public perception of motorcycling in America. It shifted the image from rebellious outlaw gangs in leather jackets to clean-cut college students and everyday commuters. BSA management watched this cultural shift happen and did absolutely nothing. They considered this new, polite demographic beneath them. They stubbornly clung to their aging, traditional customer base. They continued to ship heavy, outdated, and demanding models to their American dealers. The early 1960s brought the storm directly to their shores. The Japanese manufacturers did not stop at building small commuter bikes. They scaled up their operations rapidly. They introduced larger capacity machines aimed directly at the British stronghold. Honda unleashed the CB 450. It featured a highly advanced dual overhead camshaft engine. It revved higher and ran significantly smoother than anything BSA currently produced. It did not leak a single drop of oil. Its lights did not flicker or fail in the rain. It started on the very first try, every single time. And crucially, it cost significantly less than a comparable British machine. The American dealers noticed the shift immediately. These dealers were once the most loyal subjects of the BSA empire. Now, they faced a stark reality. For years, American mechanics had to strip down brand new BSA motorcycles straight out of the shipping crate just to fix factory defects before selling them to the public. In contrast, they could uncrate a new Japanese bike, add fuel, and ride it perfectly out of the showroom door. Customers walked in, looked at the heavy, demanding British iron, and then looked at the sleek, reliable Japanese engineering. The choice became instantly obvious. The American market began to evaporate. Dealerships canceled their BSA orders by the thousands. Wooden crates of unsold British motorcycles piled up in warehouses across California and New York. The financial reports flowing back to Birmingham turned from a healthy black to a terrifying red. Sales plummeted at a catastrophic rate. The great British monopoly broke apart in a matter of months. The Japanese machines offered superior technology, better reliability, and a lower price tag. It was a brutal, efficient execution of market dominance. Back in Small Heath, deep panic set in, but the corporate arrogance stubbornly remained. Instead of tearing down their own outdated factories and starting fresh, the executives blamed external factors. They blamed government export taxes. They blamed greedy union workers. They blamed everything except their own refusal to innovate. They called emergency strategy meetings, but the men sitting around the mahogany table lacked the technical vision to fight back. They were accountants and aristocrats, not motorcycle engineers. They tried to put cosmetic updates on their old engines. They changed the shape of the fuel tanks. They painted the side panels different colors. But beneath the shiny new paint, the machinery remained exactly the same. The engine vibration still shattered light bulbs. The oil still pooled on the garage floor. The giant had been utterly exposed. The storm from the east had struck with devastating force, and the great British Empire of wheels possessed no shelter. Chapter 4. The disastrous decisions from the boardroom. The realization hit the BSA boardroom with the force of a physical blow. The Japanese manufacturers were not a temporary nuisance. They were an existential threat. The executives at Small Heath finally understood they needed to fight back. They needed new models, new technology, and a completely new approach to engineering. But instead of looking to the factory floor for solutions, they looked outward. In 1968, they made a decision that epitomized their fundamental misunderstanding of the crisis. They purchased Umberslade Hall, a magnificent, sprawling country estate located miles away from the grime and noise of Birmingham. They poured millions of pounds into transforming this aristocratic mansion into a state-of-the-art research and development facility. They believed a grand setting would inspire grand ideas. They staffed Umberslade Hall with highly educated men. They hired aerospace engineers, automotive designers, and university graduates with pristine academic records. They wanted fresh eyes on the motorcycle industry. However, they made one fatal calculation. The vast majority of these new engineers did not ride motorcycles. They did not understand the visceral connection between a rider and a machine. They viewed a motorcycle merely as a collection of mathematical equations and stress tolerances. They sat in their clean, quiet, country estate, drafting complex blueprints, completely isolated from the practical realities of heavy manufacturing. This geographical and philosophical separation created a toxic divide within the company. A bitter class war erupted between the white-collar thinkers at Umberslade and the blue-collar workers at Small Heath. The factory men possessed decades of hands-on experience. They knew how metals behaved under stress. They knew which designs worked and which designs failed on the assembly line. When the blueprints arrived from Umberslade, the factory foreman looked at them with absolute contempt. They saw designs that were overly complicated, fragile, and utterly impractical to mass produce using the tired machinery at Small Heath. The engineers at the country estate dismissed the factory workers as uneducated laborers resistant to change. The communication between the two camps completely collapsed. The products born from this dysfunctional system proved disastrous. The management desperately wanted a new commuter vehicle to rival the small Japanese mopeds. The Umberslade team designed the Aerial 3. It was a strange, three-wheeled moped with a tilting frame. They confidently predicted it would revolutionize urban transport. They poured massive amounts of capital into marketing and production. The public rejected it instantly. It was slow, unstable, and remarkably ugly. Dealerships could not give them away. The Aerial 3 project incinerated millions of pounds, exactly when the company desperately needed that cash to survive. The failures extended to their core motorcycle lineup. The engineers decided to modernize the classic twin-cylinder models by storing the engine oil inside the main frame tubes. This concept intended to save weight and update the aesthetic. The execution was a masterclass in incompetence. When the new frames arrived at the Small Heath assembly line, the workers discovered a catastrophic error. The engineers at Umberslade had designed the frame without accounting for the physical dimensions of the engine block. The engines simply did not fit into the frames. Production stopped entirely. The workers had to literally detach engine components, grind down the metal casings, and use physical force to squeeze the engines into place. A process meant to be streamlined became a slow, agonizing struggle. These engineering blunders destroyed consumer confidence entirely. The new models reached the showrooms months behind schedule, overpriced, and plagued with severe reliability issues. The American dealers, already defecting to the Japanese brands, threw up their hands in absolute despair. They refused to stock machines that required a mechanic to rebuild them before they could be sold. The crucial revenue stream from the United States completely dried up. The financial situation inside the Birmingham boardroom shifted to a terminal crisis. The accounts showed massive, unsustainable losses mounting every single month. The company burned through its historical financial reserves at a terrifying pace. The executives frantically approached banks for emergency loans to meet the weekly payroll. But the credit lines tightened rapidly. Panic took total control of the executive decision-making process. The board initiated brutal cost-cutting measures to stop the bleeding. They targeted the very heart of their own empire. They announced massive, sweeping layoffs across the Small Heath complex. The deep generational loyalty that had defined the BSA workforce for over a century shattered overnight. Men who had given their entire working lives to the company received cold redundancy notices. Fathers watched their sons get fired from jobs they believed would last forever. The factory floor became a toxic battleground of anger and profound betrayal. Wildcat strikes broke out across the production departments. The assembly lines ground to a halt. The executives fired managers and endlessly shuffled corporate organizational charts, but they could not fix the fundamental rot. They had spent millions building an aristocratic country estate for academic engineers who could not design a functional motorcycle while completely ignoring the crumbling factory and the experienced men who actually knew how to build them. Chapter 5. Factory Closure and the Death of an Icon. By 1972, the Birmingham Small Arms Company had completely run out of money. The disastrous engineering failures and the total collapse of their American export market drained their final financial reserves. The executives who once sat in their luxurious boardrooms now faced a terrifying reality. They could not pay their raw material suppliers. They could not pay their electricity bills to keep the massive iron foundries running. The giant factory at Small Heath, which once produced 1 in every 4 motorcycles on the entire planet, now stood on the very edge of total bankruptcy. The corporate arrogance that defined their golden years vanished entirely, replaced by desperate pleas for corporate survival. They had absolutely no new models to sell. They had no cash left to develop modern engine technologies. The Japanese manufacturers had completely conquered the global market with superior reliability and ruthless production efficiency. BSA had nothing left in their arsenal but their historic brand name, and history alone could not meet the weekly payroll for thousands of angry workers. In a final act of utter desperation, the board of directors begged the British government for a massive financial bailout. The politicians in London looked at the grim accounting ledgers and realized they could not let a national industrial icon simply vanish overnight without intervention. The political fallout from tens of thousands of unemployed Birmingham manufacturing workers would be politically catastrophic. Therefore, in 1973, the government orchestrated a forced corporate marriage. They took the failing remains of BSA and Triumph and merged them with their rival, Norton Villiers. This aggressive action created a new, bloated entity named Norton Villiers Triumph. The government injected millions of pounds of public taxpayer money into this new corporate structure just to keep the assembly lines moving. But this was not a genuine rescue plan. It was merely a temporary stay of execution for a dying giant. The new management team inherited a completely broken industrial system. They inherited severely outdated factory facilities, deeply flawed motorcycle engine designs, and a highly militant workforce that felt deeply betrayed by years of gross corporate mismanagement. The forced merger did not solve the fundamental problem at the core of the business. The global consumer market simply no longer wanted the outdated motorcycles they built. The actual end came with brutal and uncompromising speed. The new management looked at the sprawling, highly inefficient, Small Heath manufacturing complex and made the only mathematical decision left available to them. They had to close it down completely. The official closure announcement sent massive shockwaves through the entire city of Birmingham. The deep, multi-generational bond between the motorcycle factory and the local community shattered forever in a single afternoon. The heavy iron front gates, which had reliably welcomed generations of local workers every single morning for decades, locked shut. Inside the dark, cavernous production halls, the deafening noise of the heavy drop hammers and the precision milling machines faded into complete and final silence. Corporate liquidators arrived quickly to strip the giant factory absolutely bare. They aggressively auctioned off the heavy manufacturing machinery for a tiny fraction of its true replacement value. They sold the remaining warehouse stock of motorcycle spare parts to the highest bidder. The massive red brick factory buildings that once actively symbolized the absolute pinnacle of the British Empire's industrial might were left empty, cold, and rapidly decaying. Thousands of highly skilled mechanics, structural engineers, and assembly line workers walked out of those factory gates for the very last time. They carried their heavy metal toolboxes home to terrace streets that suddenly had absolutely no economic purpose. A profound and heavy emptiness settled over the entire Small Heath neighborhood. The local community pubs where men used to gather loudly to celebrate monthly production records fell totally quiet. The economic heart of the community simply stopped beating. The permanent death of the Birmingham Small Arms Company remains one of the most brutal and stark business lessons in modern global industrial history. It definitively proves that sheer corporate size and historical past glory guarantee absolutely nothing in a highly competitive market. BSA did not fail because they built inherently bad motorcycles during their early pioneering days. They failed spectacularly because they allowed total market dominance to breed supreme and blinding corporate arrogance. They looked down on their international competitors. They actively ignored the rapidly changing technological demands of their own loyal customers. They stubbornly refused to invest their massive corporate profits back into modernizing their aging factory floors. By the time they finally realized they urgently needed to change their business model, they lacked both the financial strength and the engineering talent to do so effectively. Today, the massive Small Heath factory complex no longer exists. The historic land was systematically cleared by bulldozers to make way for modern commercial business parks and generic retail stores. You can walk across the exact geographic spot where thousands of proud men once forged the greatest motorcycles on Earth, and you will find absolutely no physical trace of their monumental labor. The great British Empire of wheels evaporated completely, leaving behind a very stark and permanent warning. No industrial giant is ever too big to fall if it lets corporate pride completely destroy its fundamental ability to adapt.